Welcome, everyone. My guest today is Lead Analyst Logan Mohtashami to talk about the reports to keep an eye on this week, especially the labor numbers and how those will affect mortgage rates. Logan, welcome back to the podcast on this very big week for housing.
Yes, it is Jobs Week. And of course, Jobs Week is always big right now. So we're doing this on Friday morning. So of course, the Labor Day data is going to come out the week this is out. And we're going to be in Arizona speaking at the U.S. Bank Conference while this podcast comes out. But this morning, the PCE inflation, the one that Fed tracks, wants to get it down to 2%. A little bit cooler than anticipated, just by a smidge. The 10-year yield fell off of that. The Chicago PMI manufacturing data is back to Great Recession lows and COVID-19 lows. Just remember, manufacturing PMI data is a soft survey, so the Fed and the marketplace doesn't put too much weight on it. But that's in play for this week. And why this week is important is that what the housing market needs is lower rates for longer. Whenever it does get this 1% move down in mortgage rates, we see demand pick up. We saw this at the end of 2022, going into 2023, where we had 12 weeks of positive data, gave us one of the biggest month-to-month sales prints ever recorded in history. Last year, from November again, rates went down, didn't get down to 6%, but got close enough to 6.5%. It gave us 8 weeks of positive data, which gave us two reports, almost about to 500,000 more in home sales. But there has to be a period of time where rates stay lower for longer and not shoot back up, or we create a lower base and have a better range to work with. And this is why labor data now starts to get more into play. And I think for all of us that have listened to the podcast since 2022, we've always had a very, very simple rule: paper, rock, scissors, right? Labor data over inflation. It's just now that the Federal Reserve is starting to admit that, right? I think recently President Williams said, we'll cut interest rates when it's deemed warranted, when we need to, if the labor market really starts to break. So you're starting to hear more Fed presidents and even Jerome Powell start to talk about jobless claims. Start to talk about, well, if the labor data gets weaker, then we'll warrant a cut. Or the reason we're restrictive is because of the labor data. So we're finally, I think everyone is starting to get on the same page, because right now, if you look at the personal consumption expenditures, the PCE inflation, we've had a few months now with a 2 handle on it and no cuts, right? I think that's the confusing part for people. If they thought if it was all in on inflation, then, the Fed says we're very restrictive, real yields are very high. So yes, but the premise has always been they will be very restrictive as long as they possibly can until the labor market breaks, and then they'll get covered. So here are 4 data lines that are going to come out this week. I would argue the job openings is very critical to the Federal Reserve. Whether anybody likes or dislikes the job openings, they really follow that. So if the headline number starts to come down even more, if the quits percentage starts to come down even more, it puts pressure on them to talk about the labor market move. Because I could slightly hear even some of the hawkish people saying, well, the labor market isn't as tight as it used to be, but it's still tight. We're not going to cut rates until, you're starting to get the conversation going to where the labor market is going to be the front end. So of course, once a month, we're going to have this jobs report and jobs week. And that's how we should look at every single report is key, and how the bond market reacts to it.
And you've always had the level for jobless claims at 323,000. In your mind, that's when the labor market doesn't just bend, but actually breaks and might cause a pivot.
Yes. And all it needs to do is really just start heading in that area, because how do we know this? Jerome Powell said it 3 Fed press meetings ago. He said, well, we watched jobless claims, and jobless claims have been going down, right? It's cover for them, right? They can't do it if jobless claims were rising up to 323,000, because whether we believe the Fed is too restrictive or not restrictive enough, the Fed in their minds believes they are restrictive. Even Waller came out today or this week and talked about, yes, our policy is restrictive. So just cutting 3 times still means they're restrictive. This is why I'm not like a Fed pivot person, even if they cut. They're still restrictive on their policy. To me, like a real Fed pivot is either the 10-year yield starts shooting down and the labor market starts to break, and that's just going to force, like they're going to grab the Fed members, come down to Dante's Inferno with us, right? So that's that. The bond market will force them to pivot, or the Fed just basically says, okay, the labor market is breaking. We have to do our full dual mandate. We will try to move from restrictive policy to neutral policy, right? Or they say, okay, we have to go from neutral to accommodative. Something like that, to me, is what a traditional pivot is. We haven't seen it yet, right? And once a month, these 4 reports: job openings, ADP, jobless claims, and then the BLS labor data, the big one. And remember, for us, it's not just the headline job numbers, it's the wage growth, right? And the reason I bring up wage growth is that they keep on asking the Feds, well, if jobs numbers still, beat estimates, is that a reason to hike? And Powell's like, no, I mean, we created a lot of jobs last year and the growth rate of inflation fell faster. See, I think that to me was, nobody talks about it this way, but the Fed was kind of caught off guard last year because the labor data was really good. And then the inflation forecast, the inflation fell faster than what they wanted. So they can't use that argument anymore. This is why you see a pushback by Powell. But if wage growth starts to go down, we start to head to that 3 to 3.5% level, then the Fed feels more comfortable. So it's not just the headline number, it's the wage growth data, because we're in a much different phase than we were, let's say, 2 years ago. We had so much catch-up labor, like those job articles that we write every month. We create our own COVID-19 recovery model, then switch it to the labor economic recovery model, then bring it down to here. We set numbers for people. And until, like, if we are still creating over 165,000 jobs per month when we're over 159 million jobs or people employed, then even myself, my labor recovery model that I put all the eggs into this basket in, means that I wasn't bullish enough on the labor force recovery. So we're such a unique position right now for the rest of the year, but especially going into 2025, that the labor data really matters and everything is moving one way. Job openings are coming down. Jobs quits percentage is almost out of one handle on it, which that's historically, when the growth rate falling like that is recessionary. The headline jobs coming down it's still above my estimate. So you could still create jobs. But when everything starts to move one way and the growth rate of inflation has 2 handles on the 12-month PCE data, there we start to get into an area where the Fed actually can really pivot. And again, housing disproportionately gets benefited in this environment, because you're going to hear people say, well, Logan, nobody's working. It's such a stupid argument. It is such an idiotic, stupid argument I've seen for 20 years. Nobody's going to buy homes because everyone's unemployed. Not even a second grader, a 5-year-old can realize that most people are always employed in every recession, right? We don't have 90% unemployment rates or anything like that. Come on. Even COVID was a great example. 20 to 30 million people were technically unemployed. 5 million were in forbearance. That means 35 million people were off the home buying grid. And within 6 weeks, purchase application data had a V-shaped recovery. Why? Because 133 million people are working. This is not a very difficult concept to understand. This is basic arithmetic. We are going to have 158 million people plus working by the time the next recession happens. Every year, if the recession doesn't occur, we grow that number. You don't lose 120 million people in the first year. Come on. So that massive workforce, especially the home buying workforce, is there. There are regionals and pockets where you see unemployment higher than others, but disproportionately, the people that have the highest unemployment rates in every recession are high school dropouts. Okay, not exactly in the home buyer profile, unless they're part of a dual household income. So when we move into that direction, I'm trying to get people ready. We have to change all the economic decisions, but don't tell me nobody's going to buy a house, everyone's unemployed. It doesn't work that way, right? Think about it.
It does not. So I was going to say, I like it when you do the job report write-up that you do, the analysis, you always break down, like, here are the percentage of people who lost jobs. And it's always, and sadly for them, right, it's always people who didn't finish high school. And to your point, I mean, generally speaking, that might be people who don't have, high enough incomes. Debt to income ratio isn't good enough for them to qualify for housing. So on the one hand, and specifically, when we look at who's losing their jobs, you're always looking for like residential construction workers, because then that's like a double win for housing. Again, don't like to hear anybody losing their job, but if we have construction workers, residential construction workers losing their job, that is something that can lead us, into the kind of labor market that the Fed will recognize as like, yeah, we should do something, and then just the overall number.
There's all these. There's like crazy people on X that keep on telling me we need a major job loss recession to get housing demand back. No, we don't do that. We as a country, as a people, we never ever root for a job loss recession. But the reality of our economic system has been that whenever the economy starts to get weaker, rates tend to fall. That's the reality that we work with. So I think a lot of people jump the gun by thinking that the US was going into recession without the labor market breaking yet. But when it does, then as an analyst, you're supposed to take what data lines benefit in this situation and what parts of the country won't, right? Naturally, a consumption-based economy and a service-based economy out there, who loses their jobs? People in the service sector industry, right? Because there's less disposable income, But again, most people are traditionally always working. I mean, here's one thing. Even in the Great Recession, which authentically was a recession, I would take COVID out of the equation, college-educated Americans had a 5% unemployment rate. That was the peak. So dual household incomes and everything like that. You remember, it's if two people lost their jobs within a house, right? That's material. That person is in stress. But when you think about over 158 million people, and you lose, let's do a baseline assumption, 2.4 million people in the first year, something to that nature, you still got, over 155 million people working. So then the conversation starts to go, do rates go low enough? This is where it's going to get really interesting in the next recession. Do rates go low enough to really spur housing demand in a typical fashion to get us back to the traditional, I would say, normal channel of sales between 4.72 and 5.3 million, right? Does it get us there? We always see this burst in demand, but that's just the marginal home buyer. Rates would have to stay lower for a longer to have the scale buyers come in. That means every single year somebody goes, okay, I'm ready to move. Rates are 5.25. This is workable. Okay, let's in the spring. So here we have one of these it's very interesting with the new listings data. New listings data has been trending at the lowest levels ever, but it was kind of similar when we had 3% mortgage rates or we had 8% mortgage rates, right? I would argue that 2023 is a historical low year. That took us to a level that we've never seen before. So you could say 2023 was an authentic affordability shock where people can't list their homes because they can't afford. Like, this is my thing. This is why I hate the mortgage. I hate the mortgage rate lockdown. Sarah, have you figured that out about me? I just despise it.
I have. It triggers you, Logan. It triggers
think
you.
Think about this. It's people will tell me millions of people can afford to buy, but they just don't want to give up the rate. I'm like, housing affordability is not that great. Where are these? No. They can buy. They just don't want to give up the rate. This is why I've never liked that argument, because it assumes that there's this unbelievable demand that's there, which I don't believe, right? And they just don't want to, they need to move, they can move, and then they just choose not to because their rate that,
okay, so I'm not going to, I have to jump in and say, that's your definition of what that looks like to me. It's like, yes, they could move if rates were lower, right? But rates being where they are, it takes the whole affordability to a different level. So you want to parse it out, but I don't see it that way.
New listings data was
I
trending
don't
the same
care
way at
about new
3%,
listings.
3% mortgage rates in 2021 as it was right now with 7% mortgage rates. So just a little bit different, but it's still in the same range. There is a supply and demand equilibrium that has been here for 14 years after qualified mortgage. We did a podcast on that. I encourage everyone, if you want to learn inventory channels and credit channels, that's that. But in this case, back to jobs and mortgage rates. If you start to get strings of softness in demand or softness in labor reports, where we start to create 120 to 140,000 job reports, and then naturally the unemployment rate ticks up. I could argue that because of the quits ratios and everything, the unemployment rate is technically somewhat higher than what it is right now. If that occurs, then unlike before, rates could stay lower for longer instead of this back and forth, right? We have the bond market thinking we're going into recession and the Fed's going to pivot. And then when it doesn't happen, rates just go back up. Same thing this year. Rates got down to rates really went to a very remarkably, it went to a very key level, kind of like 380 on the 10-year yield. And I was like, God, really? I mean, this is a really aggressive move. But once you get the labor market softening, then you can have a little bit lower rates. And then we go into a whole discussion is like, where do we go from here? Like what does the next 2 years look like? Is our rates going to be between 4.75 and 6.5? Is that going to be the new range? Or, do rates go even lower than that? It really depends on, how bad the recession is at that point. But again, small steps, one day at a time, 1 week at a time, let the data take us there. And what the labor data took us is saying that the labor market is no longer tight. Kashkari said it was tight. No. Anybody who says that it's tight is not looking at the aggregate data, right? You're starting to see like deterioration in that, which I always say that's where the Fed's like standing up. We're doing our job. We're attacking the labor market. Remember Waller said wage growth is too high. We got to bring that down, so it's all part of the process. It's all part of the plan. And if it starts to show some little material weakness, then we start to get into a different conversation that, okay, now we have enough data to say softening is the next thing breaking. Because when it breaks, 10-year yield isn't going to wait for Jerome Powell's, press meeting. 10-year yield is going to go down. So for everyone in the mortgage and real estate industry, that matters more, right? You can have a 1% move lower in rates before Jerome Powell says anything in the next Fed meeting. So, and we've seen that already. We saw that at the end of 2022. We saw that in the end of 2023. So, but that one was, that's different. That's a very crowded trade. People thinking the economy is getting weaker. But if it's legitimately softer and breaking, whole different conversation we're having then. That's why I always say everything's going to shift around to another stage when that happens. But I do need to see the labor market breaking because, again, not a Fed pivot person, because the whole thing was to break the labor market, because that's what the old Fed models of the past told them. You have to be restrictive enough to break the labor market, and then the entrenched inflation goes away. Companies can't, push prices increases on their consumers, and then that changes, and the growth rate can get down to 2%.
And, the spreads, right? So the spreads are another thing that can, they don't have to wait on Jerome Powell or the Fed to do anything. We've already seen them improving this year.
Yeah, again, last year, the most negative story for housing, I thought, was the spreads got worse after the banking crisis. This year, spreads got better, right? There's no banking crisis. There's nothing to push the spreads up higher. So, It's happened a little bit earlier than I thought it would. I thought the closer we get to an authentic rate cut, the spreads would be kind of where they are today. But man, I tell you, 60 basis points difference you could have in rates, compared to where the worst levels that we had in 2023. That's a material thing, right? So we're not talking about 8% rates, even though the 10-year yield got to 4.75, even close to 5%. We're not in that 8% because the spreads are better. The spreads get better and the 10-year yield falls by itself. Oh, that's a double whammy effect, right? or as John Constantine says, into the light, right? There you go. That's the double. And it's been so long, it is interesting because, more and more people are asking me for the spread charts, and I say, okay, I'm going to give you this link, keep it handy, but I want you to go back to the 1970s. Look at every single cycle. The spreads go up, spreads go down, spreads go up, spreads go down. There are certain points. Sometimes the spreads are very stable. Sometimes they're not, but they always do come down, right, at a point. So it's been so long that I don't think people have thought this through. What if you get the 10-year yield and the spreads coming down together? That is a double whammy effect. And all of a sudden it's like, whoa, we got 5 handles on mortgage rates if that occurs, right? So that's a very big reality, because right now we're still 75 basis to 1% above normal spreads. Just that gets us, in some cases, with a 5 handle. If the 10-year yield comes down and the spreads get down, and then, oh my God, and people can have sex again and have kids and buy homes, and we're living the American life like we've had for decades before. And then who's going to be really mad? Neil Kashkari. Neil Kashkari is going to be so grumpy. It's funny because I had to replay his 2000. Like, literally, people forgot he said this on TV that 6% mortgage rates is a problem, making our jobs harder. So I have to keep on playing that video, and people go, oh my God, he really did say that. Oh yeah, homie did say that, right? So everybody in America will be happy except for the housing bubble crash people, who are the anti-central bank people, who are 24/7 doomsday, and then Neil Kashkari. And those two groups hate each other. So we're going to make a nice little picture of them in a kind of Last Supper kind of thing. They both deserve each other at that point, but we'll cross that bridge when we get there. Now, not the case. Now the good story for 2024 is the spreads are getting better. That's good, but inventory is growing. So it's going to be Memorial Day weekend that had the last week's data. So usually you see a fall in new listings. I don't know if I'm going to get my 80,000. And just for everybody to know, usually the seasonal peaks are 80 to 110,000 for the pre-COVID from 2013 and 19. So we're not like too far from normal. We're just a little bit lower than what we traditionally see. So we'll see how the rest of the year goes. But again, another interesting year, Sarah. We're doing this podcast in a period of time where things are very interesting. The last decade, boy, it was just like,
I know, it was crazy. Okay, well, I have to cut this off just a little bit early today, but so excited. Thanks for being on, and also all our listeners. We are going to cover all of these reports in the newsroom, and then Logan comes back and does analysis of them. So keep an eye out for that. And of course, for our housing market tracker, which will already be published by the time this comes out. So Logan, we will talk to you again in a few days on this podcast. I will see you in Phoenix.
Yes, see you in Arizona at the U.S. Bank Conference. 3 big screen charts, Oh, on one last note, I actually gave a class presentation to Berkeley.
You did? You got to talk to their...
Yeah, I got to talk nerdy, and the kids had good questions, right? But they're all like, thanking me. They're like, Mr. Thank you, sir. And I'm like, man, I'm that age now, right? I got kids study that. So that was a really fun experience.
That is amazing. Yeah, we're going to call you Professor Mohtashami going forward here. That's or what is it? Professor X. You're one of the X. All right, Logan, thanks so much.